StarCraft is more real time than strategy. Wouldn't you agree? We've all seen those newbie questions, something like, how do I stop a maxed army of carriers? And when someone asks that, they're kind of looking for the strategy answer because they view StarCraft as more of a strategy game, which of course it is a strategy game. And you can answer them with something like, well, Vikings, right? Vikings are going to be able to target those down pretty well. Or you might go a little bit deeper and be like, oh, well, you can kind of like run around and do counterattacks because the carriers are a bit slow or something like that. But the real answer is something more along the lines of don't let them get the carriers. Well, how do you do that? Well, you work on your production and your mechanics and how to pressure while expanding and making sure that they don't have time to transition into that maxed out army of carriers, right? That's kind of the big thing. That's why people, when they are asking like pros or something like, okay, how do I get better at StarCraft? How oftentimes is it like, well, you have to produce SCVs and probes and drones consistently, right? You have to make sure that you're hitting your macro and spending your money and expanding. These are, while yes, there's an element of strategy to all of this, of course, I would say, and I think a lot of people would agree, that it is more real time than strategy. Now, why am I bringing this up? Well, I want to talk a little bit about preparation tournaments versus like weekend tournaments, right? Those are kind of the two big different types of tournaments. And we've actually seen a really interesting evolution over the years of Pro StarCraft, right? So Pro StarCraft started so long ago. What was it? Year 2000 or so. And historically, the vast majority of StarCraft tournaments were preparation-based tournaments, right? Pro League, OSL, MSL, into StarCraft 2 with GSL, back to StarCraft 1 with ASL, right? All these Korean leagues, very preparation-based. So what is the difference between a weekend tournament and a preparation tournament? Well, the weekend tournament, right, you get a bunch of players together, and they play out, it could be a bracket, could be group phases, could be a combination of the two. Hell, it could have extended series like MLG, but it's going to be played in rapid succession, right? You're going to go through a ton of opponents if you're going to end up winning the tournament, and it's going to be done in the course of a week, a weekend, whatever it is for that particular trip. Whereas with the preparation tournaments, you're going to have between 1 and 3 opponents that you're probably going to be preparing for a week or more. So the games end up looking very, very different in a preparation tournament as opposed to a weekend tournament, right? And of course, it does stand to reason that you would see more preparation-based tournaments in South Korea, a small country that everyone can kind of get together and play at one of these tournaments over a longer period of time, right? So it's like no one's flying in for a group and then flying out. It's more like, okay, yeah, I can take the 2-hour trip, like, maximum to the studio and play my group and then, go home and come back a week later and do that again. Not a big deal. Whereas in the non-Korean scene, it's more likely like, oh, there's a big LAN tournament in France. So everyone flies in, but, hotels are expensive and all that. So maybe you're there for a weekend. So it kind of makes sense where both were kind of popularized and everything. Now, of course, there are more weekend tournaments nowadays than preparation tournaments, but I think that preparation tournaments do have some important aspects and really differ greatly, right? So if you look at a weekend tournament, and this is a conversation that we had on the Pylon show a lot of times, myself and Jeff and many pro gamer guests about what's favored in each situation, right? So if we broadly define the StarCraft races, StarCraft 2 races, right? And to be completely upfront, every race can be played in every way. When I read stupid threads about, oh, Protoss has to attack early, it can't be played late game or something, it's like, no, that's not the case. Maybe its units, its design lend itself better towards rushing attacks, but really every race can be played in every way. But all that aside, let's broadly define some of the strengths of the races, right? So Zerg in general is kind of a defensive macro-esque race. Yes, people rush and things like that, but really, that's where the big strengths of Zerg are. Terran, generally more of a timing attack race, keeping pressure on, getting to your timing and just pushing with everything you've got. And then Protoss is kind of somewhere in between. Like it can be very, very aggressive. It can play towards the late game. It can be very prepped out, or you can try to play that blankety style. And of course, again, everything is kind of in there. But that's a conversation we had a lot of times on the Pylon Show, where it was like, the general consensus was that, like, for instance, a Zerg would do maybe better in a weekend tournament than in a preparation tournament, right? Like, where is Zerg strongest? Well, the longer the game goes, Zerg generally gets a bit stronger. It's when they take that heavy damage in the early game. If they haven't reacted correctly to that, that's where it's very easy to kill a Zerg off, right? And then it's like, oh, well, maybe the preparation where you're really prepping very teched out builds with Terran and hitting timing attacks, maybe that's a more Terran focused area. So let's say that you are playing a reactive defensive style in a weekend tournament, right? It makes sense in a way. You don't know, maybe you know like your first opponent or something like that in the tournament. That's a possibility, or a couple of your opponents that you know that you'll end up facing, or maybe you're a top end player. So you're like, I'll probably hit this guy later on as long as he doesn't mess up, that type of thing. Sure. But a lot of times it's going to be a huge set of matches. You're going to be playing a vast array of different opponents. So a defensive reactive style is very smart to play in a tournament like that if you're capable, right? So if you play like kind of as close to perfectly defensively as possible, wait for errors to accumulate on your opponent's side, block a couple things, and then move in for the kill. Whereas in a preparation tournament, it is a bit different, right? Like you can't just play like a defensive reactive style. It's not going to generally work quite as well, because let's say that you only play defensive reactive styles. Well, your opponents are going to be able to look at that and say, oh, okay, well, I mean, maybe, you know, there's a hole in that, or maybe we can play a little bit more greedily because it's not likely that he's ready to open with a more aggressive build, right? So there is that type of mind game. There's the strategy preparation. We've seen a lot of really amazing strategy preparation in those preparation tournaments, such as like who can forget SOS's Nexus in the main base to warp in a DT, right? That was absolutely insane. My favorite example of great preparation for a tournament still to this day is Squirtle's group, where he had 3 Terrans. And in every game, he made his build look exactly the same and did completely different things. It was just, I think it was probably the most masterful display of pre-strategic planning that we may have ever seen. Of course, we've seen this over the years as well. Maru really excelling at having these really strong, aggressive game plans. 3 of his GSLs were based, like his first 3 GSLs, in fact, were based off of very, very aggressive play. And then, in fact, because at that point he had been so aggressive, the 4th GSL was with very defensive play overall. So I think that those things are like very important, very rich aspects of the tournament preparation game. It makes sense when you think about this, right? So let's talk about Protoss for a second. Who is the most successful, the strongest ever weekend Protoss tournament player? I would argue that it's Stats. Now, Stats didn't end up winning a lot of tournaments. He was kind of the nemesis of Serral, what Serral stepped over to win so many events, but he played the most defensive macro style that we have like ever seen for Protoss, ever. And that's really, I think the weekend tournaments are more where he excelled. He did have an ASL victory. In fact, he might have won an SSL now that I'm thinking about it, that old league, if you remember that. Obviously, you know, one of the best players in the world for a very long time, had a lot of great results. But I think that he really showed what Protoss could do with that type of mindset. And now let's look at, you know, Protoss went through a big dry streak in GSL victories for a very, very long time. Now, who brought them out of that dry streak? Hero. The more aggressive Protoss player, the more creative Protoss player in many ways, right? And it's not a big surprise that Hero is a bit more volatile in weekend tournaments. It's hard to make a style like his work consistently against a huge range of opponents that you have right in a row. So Rayner recently played in the GSL, and as you may have seen, didn't have the greatest time of it. Did end up losing last place in the group, despite being one of the world's best Zerg players. And I think that part of that is because it was a preparation-based tournament. If you saw the games, Gumiho actually ended up taking down Rayner with mech, but then used bio against Sue and ended up losing. So I actually had a friend ask Gumio some questions about this, and he said he's very confident in his bio, but he knew specifically that Rayner is weak against mech, so he decided to use mech against Rayner. Doesn't really regret his decisions here, but I think that this shows the type of way that you can have a preparation tournament really turn out very differently. Whereas, let's say that Gumiho is flying to Katowice and doesn't really know who he's going to play against. I'm not sure how many mech games we're really going to see out of him, right? Like how much percentage of his practice time is going to be, to prepare mech for a player that might not be as ready for that when he's just as confident in a bio play, right? Like I feel like you're going to see much less. Whereas when you're in a group and you know who you're going to play, it's like, okay, well, I'm going to use mech 33% of the time today, right? So I think that it's just the preparation tournaments are like a very important aspect of StarCraft. They always have been, and they really do provide different results. So this, of course, brings us to the greats of these couple of formats, right? So I would say in the weekend type of format, without any doubt, Cyril has shown himself to be the strongest player, right? He has the best defensive game, the best reactive macro game, I think, of anyone. And I think he's shown that over the course of time very, very cleanly, how he can kind of block everything and then eventually overwhelm you. I think it's the perfect style for that type of tournament. And then you look at the preparation tournaments, and I think you have to basically go with Maru for the most part, right? Like he's got just such a wide variety of strategies that he can pull out at different times. It seems like he preps extremely well. He has these really tight builds that he puts together and obviously has great success. Of course, there are other players in GSL like that, like Rogue, who, he had the one finals he had against Maru, that was supposed to be our best finals ever. And Rogue brought a bunch of Roach builds that were completely off meta for a very long time. You could tell that Maru had been practicing for like a more Ling Bane type approach instead of a Roach based approach. And it was one of the worst finals we ever had. So definitely it can give you a wide range of games in those preparation events. But I just wanted to kind of talk about this a little bit because they really are different, important formats. And I think it's important to realize that and acknowledge it. So let me know what you guys think about what I've said here. Thanks for watching.